Dakota Territory, October 23rd, 1886. The spade bit into clay 4 feet below grade level, and Jim Halverson's shoulders burned with the rhythm he'd maintained since dawn. Anna sat at the excavation's edge, 8 years old and patient beyond her age, swinging her legs over the pit while she traced letters in the dirt with a stick. The lunch basket rested beside her, untouched since noon. She stopped tracing and looked down at him, her voice carrying that particular tone children use when they've been thinking too long about something that worries them. "Papa, why aren't you building a house like Mr. Bennett?" The question hung in the October air while Jim straightened, dirt clinging to his work shirt. His hands found the small of his back, pressing against muscles that would ache tonight. Sweat cooled on his neck despite the autumn chills settling over the prairie grass. He looked up at his daughter, backlit by afternoon sun, and the image dissolved into another time, another face. Wisconsin, 2 winters passed. Sarah in their balloon frame cabin, wrapped in every quilt they owned, her breath rattling in lungs that couldn't find warmth no matter how much wood he burned. The doctor's words still echoed with surgical precision. "She needs constant heat, stable temperatures. This cabin is working against her recovery." Jim had fed that stove every hour through February nights, watching his savings turn to ash, while the walls leaked precious warmth through gaps no amount of chinking could seal. The morning he found her cold, the fire had still been burning. He blinked back to Dakota's sunlight in his daughter's waiting eyes. "Because I'm building something that won't ever get cold, sweetheart. I promised your mama." Anna's expression shifted, understanding bleeding through in the way her shoulders settled, accepting what she couldn't quite grasp yet. "But the other people laugh at you." "They laugh now. Come January, they'll understand." The words came out rougher than he intended, carrying weight he hadn't meant to put on an 8-year-old's conscience. But Anna just nodded, picked up her stick again, went back to practicing the alphabet in Dakota dust, while her father returned to digging what the township was already calling his grave. 3 weeks earlier, Jim had stepped off the train at the railhead 12 miles south with everything he owned, compressed into 2 canvas bags and a carpenter's toolbox. Anna had clutched his hand through the entire journey from Minnesota, her small fingers tight around his whenever the train swayed. The land office clerk in the territorial capital had processed his claim with bureaucratic indifference. 160 acres, quarter section, Northeast Dakota Territory. Homestead Act standard terms. The clerk's pen had scratched across official papers while Jim signed his name beside the X that marked his future. The ride out to the claim had revealed rolling prairie broken by occasional creek bottoms where cottonwood and willow clustered. His 160 acres included a south-facing hillside that caught low sun even in winter, exactly the feature he'd been searching for. The land agent driving the wagon had pointed out the Bennett claim to the west, the Mueller homestead to the north, told him which neighbors were established and which were new like him. By the time they'd reached his land, Jim had already mapped the excavation in his mind. The hillside's gentle slope, the drainage pattern where snowmelt would flow, the soil composition visible in the creek cut where erosion had exposed layers. Everything his grandfather had taught him about reading land, about understanding what earth could offer if you worked with it instead of against it. He'd pitched a canvas tent that first night, Anna sleeping while he sat outside watching stars wheel overhead. The toolbox beside him held more than hammers and saws. Wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom lay his grandfather's journal, pages filled with Norwegian script and careful diagrams. The old man had died when Jim was 15, but not before passing down knowledge carried from fjord country, lessons learned in winters that made Dakota seem gentle. The next morning, Jim had walked the township's scattered homesteads, introducing himself, taking measure of what his neighbors were building. Thomas Bennett's cabin was already framed, 16 by 20 feet of balloon construction rising against the sky. The man had greeted him with the confident warmth of someone whose house was nearly finished while winter approached. He'd offered advice without being asked, explained how he'd gotten his lumber from Samuel Garrett's freight operation, showed off the tar paper and cedar shingles that would make his cabin weatherproof. Clara Bennett had been kinder, bringing out coffee while the men talked, her questions about Anna gentle and genuine. Their son Daniel worked alongside his father, 15 years old and growing into the strength needed for frontier life. The Muller family had been harder to read. Otto's English carried the thick accent of recent immigration. his hands calloused from labor but his eyes holding the desperate calculation of someone counting pennies against winter's approach. Katrine had smiled but said little, 3 children orbiting her skirts like anxious satellites. Their cabin was smaller than Bennett's, single-wall construction using boards that were clearly seconds, gaps between planks that would need serious chinking before first snow. Jim had walked back to his own claim that afternoon with his decision crystallizing. He had exactly $180 in savings from 3 years at the lumber mill. A standard cabin following Bennett's pattern would consume 40 to 60 of those dollars just in materials, assuming he could get Garrett's prices down through negotiation. The remaining money had to last until spring planting could be converted to cash crops, had to cover food and necessities for himself and Anna through 6 months of winter. But more than economics drove his choice. He'd seen Sarah die in a structure everyone called proper and civilized. He'd watched conventional construction fail the one person he had sworn to protect. The mathematics of heat loss didn't care about appearances or social acceptance. Below the frost line, Earth maintained constant temperature. Thermal mass that size couldn't be matched by any amount of wood and tar paper. He'd started digging the next morning, and the mockery had begun before he'd gone 2 feet deep. Samuel Garrett had been the first to stop, reining his freight wagon beside the excavation site on the 3rd day of work. The man cut an impressive figure, broad shoulders, expensive vest, gold watch chain catching sunlight. He'd built his business hauling lumber and supplies from the railhead, and his success showed in the quality of his horses, the maintenance of his equipment. His voice had carried the tone of someone dispensing wisdom to the ignorant. "You're digging a grave, Halverson." Jim had kept working, letting his spade answer while sweat ran down his spine. Garrett had tried again, harder. "Ground stays wet down there. Come spring thaw, you'll drown in your own cellar. I've got catalog plans from lumber companies back east, weatherproof designs that go up in 3 weeks. $47 for the complete package, delivered to your claim." Only then had Jim straightened, met the freight agent's eyes. "I'm digging a home that won't kill my daughter. That hole won't keep anyone warm. Buy lumber, build proper like an American." The words had landed with the full weight of their implication. "You're Norwegian," they said without saying. "You're foreign, you're backward, you're regressing to primitive methods that civilized men abandoned." Jim had tasted that particular flavor of judgment before, had learned when to swallow it and when to spit it back. "I've got enough lumber experience to know what it can't do. This earth will do better." Garrett's expression had shifted then, moving from advice to assessment. He'd looked at the excavation, at the careful benching of the walls, at the measurements Jim had marked with stakes and string. Whatever he'd seen hadn't changed his conclusion. "Your funeral. Don't come begging when winter freezes you out." The wagon had rolled away trailing dust, and Jim had returned to digging, his daughter's worried eyes watching from the tent. By the end of the first week, Margaret Hayes had recorded the situation in her general store ledger. The woman ran the township's only commercial establishment, a rough building that served as store, post office, and community gathering point. She kept weather records with scientific precision, tracked temperatures 3 times daily, maintained correspondence with military weather stations across the territory. Her ledger doubled as journal, mixing inventory counts with observations about the scattered homesteaders in her service area. October 26th entry, written in careful script, Halverson's excavation measures 12 by 16 feet, 7 feet deep at the back wall. Entire township calls it the Fool's Grave. Thomas Bennett offered to help build proper cabin. Halverson refused. His daughter watches him dig every day. That child will freeze come January. Jim had seen the ledger once when buying flour and beans, had noticed Margaret's precise handwriting, the attention to detail that marked her as someone who observed more than she spoke. She'd been polite but distant, neither mocking nor supporting, just recording what she saw with the detachment of someone who'd learned not to invest too heavily in any particular homesteader's survival. The work consumed October in steady increments of progress. Jim excavated in careful layers, benching the sides in 2-foot steps to prevent collapse, checking his measurements with knotted rope marked at 12-inch intervals. His grandfather's journal provided the mathematics. Back wall descending 7 feet from grade level, front wall only 3.5 feet below ground, creating a sloped floor plan that would shed moisture naturally while maximizing headroom without requiring timber he couldn't afford. The excavation exposed Dakota geology in cross-section. Topsoil gave way to clay subsoil at 2 feet, the dense material both blessing and curse. Hard digging, but stable when properly worked. And critically, the clay showed no signs of seasonal frost penetration below 40 inches. The frost line here was shallow enough that his excavation would reach soil that never froze, never swung more than a few degrees from its year-round temperature of 50 degrees. Anna helped when she could, handing down tools, carrying away buckets of excavated clay. Jim taught her measurements, showed her how to check the levels using water in a wooden trough, explained why the back wall needed to be deeper than the front. She absorbed information with the quick understanding of children who've learned that paying attention keeps them safe. Evenings, after work stopped and supper had been eaten from their camp stove, Jim would open his grandfather's journal by lamplight. The old man's careful Norwegian script filled pages with diagrams and calculations, observations from decades of building in harsh climates. One passage Jim returned to repeatedly, had almost memorized: Jordan Husker v. Mennesker Glemmer. Big Meden, Ikamoten. The earth remembers what men forget. Build with it, not against it. The drainage system came next, critical infrastructure that conventional builders often neglected. Jim cut a swale 18 inches wide and 12 inches deep around the uphill perimeter, grading it to fall 1 inch per 8 feet of run. The mathematics were simple but unforgiving. Water flows downhill, and wet earth conducts heat away 20 times faster than dry earth. Every drop of snowmelt or rain that reached his excavation walls was heat loss he couldn't afford. Inside the floor area, he installed a French drain system using field stones gathered from creek beds. 4 to 6 inches of graded stone beneath where his floor would eventually sit, creating a capillary break that would intercept any subsurface moisture and channel it to daylight through carefully graded outlets. The work was invisible once finished, the kind of detail that separated successful earth-sheltered construction from the crude dugouts desperate settlers sometimes scraped together in emergency conditions. Thomas Bennett stopped by during the drainage work, ostensibly to be neighborly, but clearly curious about what he was seeing. "Jim, this is embarrassing. You're putting more work into a hole than I put into my entire cabin." The comment carried layered meaning: waste of effort, misplaced priorities, stubbornness in the face of common sense. Jim had kept working, setting stones with precision, ensuring each piece contributed to the gradient he needed. Bennett had tried again, voice carrying genuine concern mixed with condescension. "Build a real house. That dugout is a grave, not a home. My cabin's up in 3 weeks. Yours is going to take, what, 2 months?" Anna had been sitting nearby, close enough to hear, and the way her shoulders hunched told Jim the words had landed. He'd straightened then, met Bennett's eyes with the level gaze he reserved for moments that mattered. "I'm building something that won't fail when my daughter needs it most. How long it takes is less important than how well it works." Bennett had shaken his head, the gesture of a man who'd offered help and been refused. "Suit yourself. But when winter comes and you're freezing in that hole, don't expect me to bail you out." After he'd left, Anna had come over, her voice small. "Papa, are we doing the right thing?" Jim had pulled her close, feeling how thin she was, how much she trusted him to make decisions that would keep her safe. "Your grandfather saved his whole family doing this. Now I'm going to save us." The structural system required careful calculation and precise execution. Cottonwood posts 6 to 7 inches in diameter, cut green from creek bottoms and peeled smooth to prevent rot. Jim selected each one personally, walking the creek until he found timber with the right characteristics. Straight grain, no major knots, proper taper. He hauled them to the excavation site using a borrowed horse, then set them at 24-inch centers along the excavated walls. Each post had to be scribed to fit the irregular earth wall behind it, then chinked with stones and clay to create an airtight seal. The work was slow and exacting, demanding attention to detail that made Anna yawn as she watched. But Jim knew that thermal performance would depend on these seals, that every gap was a thermal bridge where coal could penetrate. The roof structure presented the greatest engineering challenge. Poles 7 to 8 inches in diameter would span the 12-foot width at 16 to 18-inch centers, carrying dead load of 30 to 40 pounds per square foot when dry, potentially 60 to 80 pounds per square foot when saturated with rain and supporting snow accumulation. Jim worked through the calculations in his grandfather's journal, checking and rechecking the mathematics. Cottonwood at that diameter could handle the stress, but only if he graded each pole properly, rejecting any with knots or defects that would create weak points. Deflection was the critical factor. Less than half an inch of sag at midspan under maximum loading. Too much flex and the sod roof would crack, creating leaks that would defeat the entire structure's purpose. Late October brought the first serious test of community opinion. Otto Muller came by the excavation site, 3 children in tow, desperation showing in the way his eyes tracked Jim's progress. His cabin was barely half finished, single-wall construction using lumber that Garrett had sold him at premium prices because Otto couldn't afford to wait for better deals. His English was broken but earnest. "Herr Halverson, you think this work? This hole in ground?" Jim had paused, recognizing the question behind the question. Muzeller was running out of time and money, trying to decide if he should abandon his cabin and copy Jim's approach. "It'll work if it's done right, but it takes longer than you've got left before snow." Muller's shoulders had slumped, the confirmation of what he'd already feared. "My cabin, it is nicht gut, not good, but is all I can make now." The man's youngest daughter, maybe 4 years old, had wandered over to Anna, and the 2 children had regarded each other with the solemn curiosity of kids meeting on the frontier. Anna had offered her a stick for drawing in the dirt, and for a few minutes the adults had watched them trace shapes while the October wind picked up. Jim had made a decision then, one that would cost him time but might save a neighbor's family. "When you finish your cabin, come back. I'll show you how to bank it for winter, how to improve what you've got." Muller's gratitude had been immediate and almost painful to witness. The relief of a drowning man offered a rope. He'd gripped Jim's hand with both of his own, words tumbling out in German mixed with English. Thanks mixed with relief. After they'd left, Anna had looked up at her father with questions in her eyes. "You're going to help him even though he didn't help us?" "That's what people do, sweetheart. We help each other survive." The lesson was one Sarah would have taught if she'd lived, and Jim felt her absence like a physical weight as he spoke the words she should have been saying. November arrived with frost painting the buffalo grass silver 3 mornings running. Jim worked faster now, aware that weather was closing its window. The roof poles went up, massive timbers hauled into place using a simple lever system he'd rigged from spare lumber. Each pole had to be positioned exactly, bearing evenly on the wall posts, creating a structure that would distribute loads properly. The brush and grass thatch layer came next, 2 to 3 inches thick, laid over the pole rafters. This layer served multiple purposes: drainage plane to keep water from pooling, thermal break to prevent direct contact between sod blocks and structural members, and cushioning to protect the living root systems that would knit the final roof together. Sod cutting was brutal work that left Jim's back screaming by day's end. Each block measured roughly 6 inches thick by 12 inches wide by 18 inches long, cut with roots intact to maintain structural integrity. The blocks were heavy, 40 pounds or more when wet, and had to be laid grass-side down in overlapping courses like enormous shingles. Anna tried to help but couldn't lift the blocks, so she fetched water instead, keeping Jim hydrated while he worked from dawn until darkness made precision impossible. The roof rose in layers, each course overlapping the one below, roots from upper blocks interweaving with lower blocks to create what would eventually become a living membrane. By November 7th, the dugout was complete. 6 weeks of steady work had transformed a south-facing hillside into a structure that looked, from any distance, like nothing more than a grass-covered burial mound. Only the stovepipe protruding from the sod roof and the recessed doorway cut into the south slope suggested human habitation. Samuel Garrett made a final visit that afternoon, his wagon loaded with lumber for a homesteader building conventional construction. He'd pulled up, looked at the finished dugout with an expression mixing pity and contempt. "Nice grave, Halverson. At least you won't have far to carry your daughter's body come February." The words had hit Anna like a slap, her face going pale. Jim had felt rage rise in his throat, hot and chemical, the urge to put his fist through Garrett's smug expression almost overwhelming. But Anna was watching, learning how her father handled men who threatened with words instead of fists. "My daughter will outlive your prejudice." His voice had come out level, hard as the cottonwood posts supporting his roof. Garrett had snorted, snapped his reins, driven off trailing dust and dismissal. That night, Jim and Anna moved into the dugout. Their few possessions fit easily in the 12 by 16-foot space. Bedding, clothes, cooking equipment, Jim's toolbox, and grandfather's journal. The small stove Jim had purchased from a bankrupt homesteader sat against the north wall, its 6-inch pipe rising through a carefully sealed collar in the roof. Anna stood in the center of the space, turning slowly, taking in walls that seemed to press close after weeks of sleeping in the canvas tent. The single south-facing window admitted autumn light that couldn't quite reach the back corners. "Papa, it's dark." Her voice carried uncertainty, maybe fear, and Jim understood what she wasn't saying. This looked like a cave, felt like being buried, matched every warning the other settlers had given about living underground like animals. He lit the lamps he'd mounted on the wall posts, and warm light pushed back shadows. Then he started a small fire in the stove, just kindling and a few pieces of split cottonwood, measuring the wood carefully. Within 30 minutes, the transformation began. The dugout's temperature, which had been matching the outdoor 50-degree reading, started climbing. 55 degrees, 58, 60. Jim checked his thermometer repeatedly, making notes in a ledger he'd started specifically for tracking the dugout's performance. Outside temperature was holding at 38 degrees as sunset approached. Anna noticed the change without needing the thermometer, her coat coming off first, then her sweater, until she stood in just her dress and looked at her father with wonder breaking through. "Papa, it's warm, really warm." Jim had smiled then, the first genuine smile since Sarah died, because his daughter was safe and comfortable, and the mathematics hadn't lied. "And we're only burning 2 pounds of wood an hour. Mr. Bennett's cabin uses 6 pounds or more for worse heat." They'd eaten supper by lamplight, soup heated on the stove, bread Margaret Hayes had sold them along with pointed comments about proper housing. The food tasted better than it should have, flavored by relief and vindication and the steady warmth that wrapped around them like invisible blankets. Before bed, Jim had opened his grandfather's journal to the final page, where the old man had written his last entry before the illness took him. Anna leaned against his shoulder, studying the Norwegian script she couldn't read. "What does it say, Papa?" Jim translated, his voice roughening with memory. "If I die before you build, remember, the earth keeps its promises. Men forget when they're afraid, when they're proud, when they want to look like their neighbors. But underground, the mathematics never lie. Build true, stay humble, and you'll save the ones who matter." Anna was quiet for a moment, processing words written by a man she'd never met, but who'd reached across years and ocean to protect her. He was thinking about us when he wrote that. He was thinking about family. That's all that matters in the end. On the ledger Jim maintained grew into a comprehensive record of the dugout's thermal performance. Each morning, noon and evening, he recorded interior temperature, exterior temperature, weather conditions, and fuel consumption. The data began painting an undeniable picture. November 12th, exterior temperature 15 degrees with moderate wind, interior temperature 61 degrees maintained on 2.5 pounds of wood per hour. November 15th, exterior temperature 8 degrees overnight, interior temperature coasted to 53 degrees by dawn with no fire burning after midnight. November 18th, exterior temperature dropped to -8 overnight in an unexpected early cold snap, and the real test began. Thomas Bennett's cabin, which had seemed so solid and proper when completed, struggled against the sudden cold. Jim learned about it later from Clara, who stopped by with bread as a peace offering after her husband's harsh words. She'd described Thomas feeding their stove every 45 minutes through the night, the interior temperature barely maintaining 50 degrees despite constant attention, herself and Daniel huddled in blankets while the walls seemed to radiate cold. Otto Muller's experience was worse. His single-wall construction and inadequate stove couldn't maintain above 40 degrees despite his burning wood at rates that would exhaust his winter supply by January. Katrine and the children slept in one bed for warmth, wearing layers of clothing, and still Otto woke to find frost forming on the interior walls 3 feet from the stove. Jim's dugout had performed exactly as his grandfather's mathematics predicted. He'd built a small fire at 10 in the evening, let it die to coals by midnight, gone to sleep with Anna warm beside him. 6 in the morning, he had woken to interior temperature of 52 degrees, cold enough to see his breath, but nowhere near the life-threatening conditions developing in surface structures. Anna had slept through the night comfortably, and that was the only metric that truly mattered. The morning after the cold snap, Thomas Bennett walked past the dugout on his way to Margaret Hayes' store. Jim was outside splitting wood, Anna playing in pale November sunlight. Bennett's route took him close enough to see the minimal smoke from Jim's chimney, to notice Anna's lack of heavy winter clothing despite temperatures still below 20 degrees. Bennett slowed, stopped, his expression cycling through confusion to realization to something that might have been respect if pride hadn't been blocking the way. He opened his mouth as if to speak, changed his mind, kept walking. But doubt had been planted, and Jim had seen it take root. November progressed into early December with steady cold settling over Dakota territory. Margaret Hayes began systematic data collection, her scientific mind recognizing patterns that demanded documentation. She took permission from Jim, Thomas, and Otto to enter their structures 3 times daily for temperature readings, creating a comparative study that would prove or disprove the dugout's performance against conventional wisdom. Her ledger filled with numbers that told stories more clearly than words. December 1st, exterior -12, Bennett cabin 48 degrees interior, on 1/4 cord wood consumption per day. Muller cabin 42 degrees on similar consumption. Halverson dugout 59 degrees on 40 pounds wood per day. December 5th, exterior -18 with 20-mile-per-hour winds. Bennett cabin maintaining 50 degrees with constant feeding. Muller cabin struggling to 40. Halverson dugout 60 degrees with fire banked overnight. The economics became impossible to ignore. Jim calculated his fuel consumption rate and projected through a 6-month heating season, 2 to 3 cords of wood total. Bennett's cabin would require 7 to 9 cords for equivalent comfort. At Garrett's prices of $3 per delivered cord, the difference represented $15 to $20, nearly half a year's cash income for a subsistence homesteader. But more important than money was the safety margin. Conventional cabins operated at maximum capacity during normal cold weather, leaving no buffer for equipment failure or extreme conditions. Jim's dugout maintained comfortable temperatures with massive thermal reserve, the earth beneath providing stability that wood and tar paper could never match. Anna thrived in the steady warmth, her cough from the train journey finally clearing, color returning to cheeks that had been pale through October's uncertainty. She helped Jim with household tasks, learning to cook on the stove, to manage lamps and maintain the living space. Evenings they read together by lamplight, Jim working through the primers he'd bought so Anna could continue education that regular school attendance would have provided if they'd been in town. One night she looked up from her reader with a question that had clearly been forming for days. "Papa, if our house is so much better, why won't anyone else build one?" Jim set aside his own book, considering how to explain human nature to someone who still believed adults were rational. Because admitting they're wrong means admitting they risk their families for pride. That's hard for people to face, but keeping their families cold is worse. You'd think so, but pride makes people do strange things. Anna absorbed this, returned to her reading, and Jim felt Sarah's absence sharply. These conversations should have been shared, the teaching of their daughter a joint project instead of his solitary burden. December 14th brought another significant cold snap, temperatures dropping to -18 with 20-mile-per-hour winds from the northwest. The comparative data from this event would prove decisive in shifting community opinion, though pride would prevent public acknowledgement for weeks yet. Bennett cabin required constant feeding through the night, Thomas and Daniel taking shifts, interior temperature fluctuating between 45 and 55 degrees, depending on how recently wood had been added. The potbelly stove glowed cherry red at times, consuming fuel at rates that made Thomas's winter supply calculations look increasingly desperate. Water in the basin by morning showed a skin of ice, despite the bucket sitting 4 feet from the stove. Mueller cabin failed more dramatically. Otto couldn't maintain interior temperature above 40 degrees despite burning wood as fast as he dared, without risking a chimney fire. The children slept in layers of clothing, and Katrine spent the night holding the youngest to share body heat. By dawn, frost covered the interior walls, and Otto's hands shook from exhaustion and cold as he tried to restart a fire that had nearly died. Jim's dugout coasted through the same night with casual indifference to exterior conditions. Small fire at 10 in the evening, allowed to die by midnight, interior temperature dropping slowly from 60 degrees to 51 degrees by dawn. Anna slept peacefully, and Jim woke refreshed rather than exhausted from night-long fire tending. The temperature differential wasn't just comfort, it was survival margin. If a conventional cabin stove failed, occupants had hours before hypothermia became life-threatening. If Jim's fire went out completely, the thermal mass would keep the dugout above freezing for days. Morning after the cold snap revealed community stress in visible ways. Thomas Bennett looked haggard at Margaret's store, buying additional firewood at premium winter prices because his supply calculations hadn't accounted for weather this severe this early. Otto Muller bought nothing because he couldn't afford more wood, just stood in the store warming himself by Margaret's stove with the desperate look of a man running out of options. Margaret showed Jim her data log when he came in for flour and coffee. The numbers were damning for conventional construction, validating for earth-sheltered design. She didn't comment, just let the mathematics speak. Jim noticed Clara Bennett watching him from across the store, her expression mixing calculation with worry. When Thomas was distracted examining tool inventory, she approached quickly, voice low. "Mr. Halverson, may I ask you something?" "Of course, Mrs. Bennett. This cold. Your dugout really stays warm? Margaret's numbers are accurate? You're welcome to visit. See for yourself." Thomas wouldn't approve. The admission cost her something, and Jim recognized the courage it took for a woman to publicly question her husband's decisions. "The offer stands whenever you need it." She'd nodded, moved away before Thomas noticed the conversation, but the seed had been planted in one more mind. December progressed with steady cold and growing recognition that Jim's methods, however strange they appeared, produced results that conventional wisdom couldn't match. Younger homesteaders began asking quiet questions when their wives weren't around to judge, inquiring about excavation techniques and drainage systems without committing to anything that might look like admission of error. Jim answered honestly, shared his grandfather's knowledge freely, took no pleasure in being proven right because he remembered too clearly the cost of learning these lessons through Sarah's death. Anna asked him one evening why he helped people who'd mocked them. "Because keeping knowledge to myself won't bring your mother back, but helping others might save someone else's family." She thought about that, nodded with the seriousness of someone learning that survival and revenge were separate choices. "Mama would want you to help." "She would, and that's why we do it." The conversation became one of those moments Jim knew he'd remember, a marker of how his daughter was growing up under frontier conditions that aged children faster than city life ever could. Late December brought another visitor who changed the trajectory of community opinion more than any amount of data could have managed. Quiet River appeared at the dugout entrance on a gray afternoon, snow beginning to fall in loose flakes that would accumulate through the night. She was Lakota, perhaps 70 years old, her face carrying the geography of decades on the prairie. Jim knew her by reputation only, the elderly woman who traded occasionally at Margaret's store, but otherwise kept to herself on land the government hadn't yet managed to claim for homesteading. She spoke English clearly, her voice carrying the precision of someone who'd learned multiple languages out of necessity. "You cut the water path." It wasn't a question. Jim nodded, understanding she was referring to the drainage swale. "My grandfather taught me. Wet ground steals heat." Quiet River moved closer to the excavation, examining the French drain system visible where Jim had left a section exposed for inspection and maintenance. She crouched, studied the stone grating, checked the slope with practiced eyes. "Your grandfather was wise. My people lived in earth lodges before the horse days. Always warm. Then we learned horses and typies from the people to the west, easier to move. But earth lodges never forgot how to keep families warm." She straightened, looked at Jim with assessment that went beyond surface judgment. "White men forgot wisdom when they came here. Built cold houses, cut all the trees, complained about weather." Her gesture took in the prairie, the scattered homesteads, the evidence of European settlement imposed on land that had its own logic. "You remembered. This is good." Anna had emerged from the dugout during the conversation, curious about the visitor. Quiet River noticed her, smiled with genuine warmth. Your daughter will be warm this winter. Others, she shook her head, the gesture conveying both prediction and sadness. They will learn. The hard way teaches best. Before leaving, she'd reached into the bag she carried, pulled out a packet of dried herbs. For tea, keeps the chest clear when cold settles in. Jim had accepted the gift with thanks that went beyond the physical offering. Quiet River's validation meant more than Margaret's data or Bennett's grudging doubt, because she represented knowledge that predated European arrival, wisdom tested through centuries instead of decades. After she'd left, Anna made tea from the herbs while Jim recorded the encounter in his ledger. The notes weren't about temperature or fuel consumption, just the observation that sometimes respect came from unexpected directions. Margaret Hayes stood in Thomas Bennett's cabin at dawn on December 1st, thermometer in hand, watching her breath crystallize in air that should have been warm. The potbelly stove radiated heat 3 feet in any direction, but the walls seemed to drink warmth and exhale cold in equal measure. Her ledger entry would record 48 degrees interior temperature against exterior reading of -12, but the numbers couldn't capture how Clara Bennett's hands shook while making coffee, or the way Daniel huddled under blankets despite being 15 and too proud to admit cold bothered him. Thomas followed her outside afterward, his voice low enough that his family wouldn't hear through the walls. Margaret, those numbers you're collecting, you sharing them? With anyone who asks? I'm not asking. She looked at him then, this man who'd been so confident in October when his cabin rose quick and proper against the sky, now hollow-eyed from nights spent feeding a stove that consumed his winter supply faster than any calculation had predicted. Suit yourself, but mathematics don't care about pride. The systematic comparison grew more comprehensive as December deepened. Margaret tracked not just temperature, but fuel consumption, comfort levels reported by occupants, moisture problems, air quality issues. She noted when Thomas added extra chinking to gaps that had opened as green lumber dried. Recorded Otto Muller's attempts to insulate his single-wall construction with mud and prairie grass packed between interior and exterior surfaces that didn't exist. The Halverson dugout data stood apart like a rebuke. 59 degrees interior on 40 pounds of wood, while Bennett burned through a quarter cord for 10 degrees less comfort. The thermal mass effects showed most clearly in overnight performance, when conventional cabins crashed toward freezing while the dugout coasted on stored heat, dropping 5 degrees over 8 hours instead of 20. Jim watched the community dynamics shift in small increments that accumulated like snow. Younger homesteaders who'd laughed in October now asked careful questions when their wives weren't listening, wanting to know about excavation techniques without committing to anything that looked like admission. Older settlers doubled down, Samuel Garrett loudest among them, insisting that proper Americans built upward, not downward, that civilization meant conquering nature, not surrendering to it. The freight agent had stopped by the dugout one gray afternoon, ostensibly to check if Jim needed any supplies, but really to measure his own position in an argument he was slowly losing. You've got folks talking, Halverson, questioning good lumber construction because of your hole. Jim had been splitting wood, Anna stacking the pieces in neat rows against the dugout's south wall. He'd set down his axe, wiped sweat despite December cold. I'm not questioning anything. Just building what works. Works for now. Wait until real winter hits. See how that grave holds up. Real winter's what I'm counting on. The colder it gets outside, the better earth shelter performs. Garrett's expression had cycled through contempt to uncertainty because the claim contradicted everything he understood about heating and shelter. Yet the data Margaret was collecting suggested impossible truths. You're turning neighbors against each other, making them doubt what they've built. I'm living in a warm house with my daughter. What they do with that information is their choice. After Garrett left, Anna had looked up from her stacking with questions written across her face. Why is he so angry that we're warm? Because every family that builds like us is money he doesn't make selling lumber. She'd absorbed this, nodded, returned to work with the understanding that adult conflicts had motives beyond the obvious. December 14th brought another data point that Margaret recorded with scientific precision, even as it troubled her conscience. Otto Muller had come to her store just before closing, 3 children trailing him like cold ghosts, desperation evident in how his hands trembled when he counted out coins for cornmeal and beans. Frau Hayes, I must ask, your numbers, they are true? The Halverson house, it is really so much warmer? She'd shown him her ledger without commentary, letting the mathematics speak. His face had crumpled slightly as he read, confirmation of what he'd feared, but hoped might be exaggeration or error. My cabin, it is not enough. The wood, it goes so fast. And still the children, they are cold at night. How much supply do you have left? Maybe to February, if we are very careful. If the weather, it is not too bad. February was 3 months away, and Dakota winter had barely begun. Margaret did calculations in her head that Otto's broken English and immigrant poverty prevented him from articulating. Insufficient fuel, inadequate shelter, 3 children under 10 years old. The mathematics of survival were narrowing toward an equation with no solution. Otto, you need to talk to Jim Halverson. He's offered to help people improve what they've built. Pride and desperation warred across Muller's face, and desperation won by the narrowest margin. He would help me? After I laugh at his hole? He's helped everyone who's asked. Otto had left with his meager supplies and something that might have been hope, though Margaret suspected hope wouldn't be enough if he waited too long to act. The crisis came 8 days later on a night when the thermometer touched -20 and kept falling. Jim woke to pounding on the dugout door at 3 in the morning, the kind of hammering that meant emergency. Anna stirred in her bed as he grabbed his coat and lantern, but he waved her back to warmth. Otto Muller stood in the doorway carrying his youngest daughter, the 4-year-old girl, limp in his arms. Behind him, Katrine clutched the other 2 children, all of them frost-covered, their breath coming in visible gasps that spoke of exposure beyond safe limits. Otto's voice cracked when he tried to speak. Bitta, please. The fire, it went out. She won't wake up. Jim pulled them inside without words, the professional assessment overriding everything else. The youngest Mueller child showed classic hypothermia signs, unconscious, breathing shallow, skin cold to touch, lips tinged blue. Katrine was near collapse herself, the 2 older children shivering so hard their teeth clacked. Anna, get all the blankets, start water heating for tea. His daughter moved with practiced efficiency, 8 years old but frontier tested, understanding that questions came later and action came now. Jim laid the unconscious child near the stove but not too close, knowing that rapid rewarming could trigger shock. He stripped her wet outer layers, wrapped her in dry wool, began the careful process of raising her core temperature without overwhelming her small body's ability to compensate. Katrine knelt beside her daughter, tears freezing on her cheeks in the transition from outside death cold to inside warmth. Her voice carried grief and guilt in equal measure. I tried to keep them warm. I tried so hard. You got them here. That's what matters. The words came out harder than Jim intended, sharpened by his own memories of trying and failing, of Sarah dying despite everything he'd done. He forced his tone gentler. She's going to be okay. The cold hasn't had her long enough. 10 minutes passed in silence, broken only by the stove's murmur and the ragged breathing of hypothermic children gradually warming. Anna brought hot tea with sugar, helped the 2 older Muller children drink despite their shaking hands. Katrine couldn't stop crying. The delayed shock of how close she'd come to losing her daughter hitting now that immediate crisis had passed. The youngest girl's eyes opened at 15 minutes, confusion giving way to awareness. Then the crying of a frightened child who didn't understand what had happened. Katrine gathered her up, rocking and murmuring in German while relief shattered what remained of her composure. Otto stood apart, his face a mask of shame and gratitude twisted together. When he finally spoke, his voice barely carried across the small space. I was wrong. I am a fool. I almost killed my children because I was too proud to ask for help. Jim remembered Thomas Bennett's words from months ago. The confidence of a man whose cabin was finished, while others still dug. Pride came before winter, and winter measured everyone against the same merciless standard. You're here now, that's what matters. The phrase was becoming his mantra, these words for people who'd made bad choices and lived long enough to regret them. Otto's shoulders shook, not from cold, but from the breaking of something that had held him rigid through months of struggling. We cannot go back. Our cabin, it is too cold. It will kill them. Jim had known this was coming from the moment he'd seen how severe their hypothermia was, had already done the mathematics of fitting 6 people into a space designed for 2. You'll stay here until weather moderates. We have nothing to pay. I don't want payment. I want your family to live. The simple declaration hung in warm air while understanding rippled through everyone present. This wasn't charity, it was something more fundamental. Jim had failed to save Sarah because he hadn't known better. Now he knew, and that knowledge demanded action. Anna brought more tea, helped settle the Muller children into the corner where she usually slept, gave up her blankets without being asked. Jim watched his daughter's generosity, saw Sarah's influence reaching across death to shape how Anna moved through the world. Katrine tried to thank him, words tumbling over each other in German and English mixed together. Gratitude and apology and relief all compressed into stammering phrases. Jim stopped her with a raised hand. Get warm, sleep. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow. 6 people in 12 by 16 feet changed the dugout's character completely. Privacy evaporated, every sound carried. The children's presence transformed silence into constant, low-level noise, questions and games and occasional tears. But the thermal mass performed exactly as Jim's grandfather's mathematics predicted, absorbing body heat from 6 people and redistributing it through the space with patient efficiency. Fuel consumption increased to 50 pounds per day, but that still represented less than half what 2 conventional cabins would require to house the same occupancy under equivalent conditions. The ventilation system Jim had designed handled the additional carbon dioxide load, fresh air cycling through while stale air exhausted, maintaining quality that prevented the headaches and respiratory distress that tight spaces could create. Anna adapted to crowded conditions with the flexibility of children who haven't yet learned to demand privacy. She played with the Mueller children, taught them English words while they taught her German counting, shared the small space with grace that made Jim's chest tight with pride and grief both. Sarah should have been here to see their daughter growing into someone remarkable. The community noticed when Muller family didn't return to their cabin, when smoke continued rising from the Halverson dugout in quantities that suggested more than 2 occupants. Speculation moved through the scattered homesteads like wind through grass. Some thought Otto had hired on as Jim's helper, working for shelter. Others assumed the Muellers had simply abandoned their claim and moved into town. Only Margaret Hayes understood what had actually happened, and she recorded it in her ledger with clinical precision. December 23rd, Mueller family relocated to Halverson Dugout following severe hypothermia incident. 6 occupants now in structure designed for 2. Interior temperature maintains 58 degrees on 50 pounds wood per day. Thomas Bennett heard about it from his wife, who'd gotten the story from Margaret in confidence, that she immediately violated because she was terrified of what it meant for her own family. Clara, that's gossip. You don't know what's really happening. But her hands shook when she poured his coffee, and Thomas recognized the tremor of fear that had been building through December's deepening cold. Thomas, our cabin barely keeps us above freezing. If something happens, if the stove fails again, like it did last week, the stove is fine. We're burning through wood faster than you calculated. We won't make it to March at this rate. The accusation in her voice cut deeper than any insult from Samuel Garrett could have managed. Because Clara was right and they both knew it. Thomas had built what everyone said was proper, had followed patterns that lumber companies published and freight agents endorsed, and his family spent every night huddled around a stove that consumed their reserves while barely holding back the cold. He stood up from breakfast, grabbed his coat with movements sharp enough to communicate anger he couldn't quite justify. I'll talk to Garrett about more wood. We can't afford more wood. Then I'll cut cottonwood from the creek. In this cold, Thomas, you'll freeze before you get a cord home. He left without answering because she was right about that too, and admitting it meant confronting choices he'd made in October that were killing his family in December. The conversation haunted Clara through the morning while she tried to keep their cabin warm enough for basic housekeeping. By afternoon, she'd made a decision that would have been unthinkable a month earlier, bundling herself against cold that burned exposed skin within minutes, walking the quarter-mile to the Halverson dugout while Thomas was away checking trap lines that hadn't produced anything in weeks. Jim answered her knock, surprise evident when he recognized Thomas Bennett's wife, standing in the snow that was beginning to accumulate from afternoon flurries. "Mrs. Bennett, is everything all right? May I come in, just for a moment?" He stepped aside, and Clara entered a space transformed by occupancy that shouldn't have been possible. 6 people lived here now, and somehow it worked. The Muller children sat in one corner working on lessons Anna was teaching, their mother cooking something that smelled like soup, warmth everywhere that should have been cramped and miserable but somehow wasn't. Clara's voice dropped low enough that the children wouldn't overhear. "Mr. Halverson, I need to know. The cold that's coming, can our cabin survive it? Can we?" Jim looked at this woman who'd been kind when her husband mocked, who'd brought bread when others brought judgment, and he couldn't lie to her. "I don't know, your cabin was built well for what it is, but the thermal performance has hard limits." "What does that mean?" "It means when it gets cold enough, conventional construction can't keep up no matter how much wood you burn." The confirmation of her fears showed in how her shoulders sagged, the careful composure cracking just enough to reveal terror underneath. "Thomas won't ask for help. He'd rather freeze than admit he was wrong. Pride is a luxury. Survival isn't. Can you teach me how you built this? Maybe if I understand, I can convince him to improve our cabin before it's too late." Jim had spent the next hour showing Clara the structural details that made Earth Shelter work, explaining thermal mass and infiltration control, sketching drainage systems and ventilation principles. She absorbed information with the desperate focus of someone studying for an examination that would determine her children's survival. Before she left, Jim made an offer he knew might create problems but couldn't withhold. "If something happens, if your cabin fails and Thomas won't come here, you bring the children anyway. Door's always open." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She blinked back quickly. "He'd never forgive me. Better alive and unforgiven than dead and justified." She'd nodded, tucked the sketches Jim had drawn into her coat, disappeared into afternoon gray that promised snow before nightfall. That evening, while Anna helped Katrine prepare supper and the Mueller children played some game involving stones and careful rules, Jim sat with his grandfather's journal and let memory take him somewhere he'd been avoiding. Wisconsin, February 1884. Sarah had been sick 3 months by then, the consumption eating through her lungs with methodical cruelty. The doctor had been blunt during his last visit. She needs stable warmth, consistent temperature above 60 degrees. This cabin is creating conditions that make recovery impossible. Jim had worked double shifts at the lumber mill, spending everything he earned on firewood because their balloon frame cabin hemorrhaged heat through walls that might as well have been screens. He'd fed that stove every hour through frozen nights, watching wood vanish into combustion that barely raised interior temperature above 50 degrees. The doctor's words had haunted him even then. "You're burning money to fight physics, and physics always wins." He'd tried everything. Hung blankets over windows, packed mud into gaps between boards, built a windbreak from scrap lumber. None of it mattered because the fundamental design was wrong, because conventional construction couldn't create the stable environment Sarah's failing body required. The morning he'd found her, the fire had still been burning. He'd fed it at 4 in the morning like always, gone back to sleep expecting to wake at 6 for the next feeding. But exhaustion from 3 months of night shifts had pulled him under deeper than usual, and he'd slept until 7:30. Sarah had been cold when he reached for her, the kind of cold that meant gone, not sleeping. The cabin interior had measured 42 degrees despite the fire-consuming wood in the stove. Her body temperature had dropped below the point of no return sometime between his 4 a.m. feeding and dawn, and she died alone while he slept 3 feet away. The doctor's words at her funeral had finished breaking something in Jim that had already cracked. If she'd had proper shelter, stable warmth, she might have recovered. Consumption isn't always fatal, but you can't heal in a freezer. Jim had left Wisconsin 2 months later, taking Anna and his guilt in his grandfather's journal to Dakota Territory, where he could build something that wouldn't fail the next person he loved. The dugout wasn't just shelter. It was penance, it was promise. It was the structure Sarah should have had. Anna's voice pulled him back to the present, her hand on his shoulder where she'd approached without him noticing. "Papa, you're crying." He hadn't realized, but his face was wet, grief and memory combining with the weight of knowing he'd saved the Mueller children, but couldn't save Sarah. "Just thinking about your mother." Anna settled beside him, 8 years old but carrying understanding beyond her age. She'd be proud you helped them. That's what Mama would have wanted. The certainty in her voice cracked something loose, and Jim pulled his daughter close, holding on to the one person Sarah had left him, the reason he kept building and helping and refusing to let pride or convention or other people's judgment determine who lived and who died. January arrived with temperatures that made December look gentle. The thermometer touched -25 on the 2nd, -30 on the 5th. The Bennett cabin burned wood at rates that made Thomas physically sick when he calculated what remained against how much winter stretched ahead. Other homesteads across the township faced similar mathematics, the cruel arithmetic of insufficient shelter meeting unlimited cold. Quiet River appeared at the dugout entrance on January 3rd, arriving without announcement the way she always did, somehow navigating prairie that would kill white settlers within an hour of exposure. She looked even older in the harsh winter light, but her eyes were sharp when she studied the sky to the northwest. Big cold coming, like the stories my grandmother's grandmother told. The year the buffalo froze standing, the year wolves died in their dens. Jim had been checking his wood supply, making calculations about how long 6 people could last if conditions deteriorated beyond current projections. Quiet River's words stopped him cold. When? She studied the sky again, reading signs Jim couldn't see. 10 days, maybe 12. When the moon thins to nothing, the cold will come with it. How bad? Worse than this. Her gesture took in temperatures that had already broken territorial records. Worse than anything you've seen. Your house will hold. Wood houses. She shook her head, the gesture conveying both prediction and sadness. You will have more visitors. Many more. The old woman reached into her pack, pulled out packets of dried meat and herbs. Extra food for the children who will come. Jim accepted the gift with understanding that went beyond the physical offering. Quiet River was preparing him for something she'd seen before in a lifetime of prairie winters, had survived because her people built with the earth instead of against it. How many will come? Everyone who wants to live. She left without further explanation, disappearing into white landscape like smoke and wind. Jim stood holding dried meat and prophecy both, trying to calculate how many people could fit in 12 by 16 feet when survival became the only metric that mattered. That night, he told the Mueller family what Quiet River had warned. Watch their faces cycle through disbelief to fear to grim acceptance. Otto's voice carried the weight of a man who'd already made one nearly fatal mistake. Herr Halverson, if others come here like we did, what will you do? Let them in, same as I did for you. But there is not room. Jim looked around the crowded space, did mathematics that had no good answer. There's more room than in frozen ground. We'll make it work. The days following Quiet River's warning brought weather signs that confirmed her prediction. Birds that should have been present disappeared completely, the prairie falling into silence that felt wrong. Animal tracks showed creatures digging deeper into whatever shelter they could find, instinct driving behavior that spoke to threats beyond normal winter. Jim stocked additional firewood, checked and rechecked his drainage systems, verified that ventilation could be adjusted for maximum occupancy. Anna helped with preparations while asking questions that showed she understood they were preparing for crisis. Papa, if everyone comes here, will there be enough food? We'll make it stretch. Will there be enough room? We'll find a way. But privately, Jim ran numbers that wouldn't balance. The dugout could theoretically hold 12 people if everyone accepted crowding that would have been unthinkable under normal circumstances. More than 12 meant choosing who to turn away, and that was a choice he couldn't let himself think about yet. Samuel Garrett came by on January 10th, ostensibly checking on his most stubborn customer, but really measuring the situation with eyes that had watched the community shift around Jim's success. Heard some talk about a big storm coming, old woman spreading prophecies. Quiet River knows this land better than any of us. She's Indian. They believe all kinds of superstitious nonsense. Jim had been splitting wood, and he set down his axe with deliberate care, buying time to control his response. She survived 70 winters on this prairie. I'll take her word over yours any day. Garrett's face flushed, anger and something else competing for dominance. The freight agent's business had suffered as word spread about dugout performance, as younger homesteaders started asking about excavation techniques instead of lumber prices. You're turning this community against itself, making people question good American building practices because you want to live like a savage in a hole. I'm living warm with my daughter while your customers freeze in cabins that physics says can't work. That's not my fault. The accusation hung between them, stark and undeniable. Garrett had sold lumber and promises to people who trusted him, had profited from construction methods that were failing across the township. Now Winter was measuring everyone against the same ruthless standard, and his prosperity looked like blood money. Garrett left without responding, his wagon tracks cutting through snow that was already beginning to drift in wind picking up from the northwest. Margaret Hayes stopped by that same afternoon, unusual because she rarely left her store during business hours. She carried her ledger and an expression Jim had learned meant serious conversation coming. "Jim, I've been tracking weather reports from military posts. There's a massive high-pressure system building over Hudson Bay, barometric readings higher than anything in recorded history. Meaning? Meaning when that air mass moves south, temperatures will drop beyond anything we've prepared for, beyond anything this territory has ever seen." Jim invited her inside, and Margaret studied the crowded dugout with the analytical eye she brought to everything. 6 people living in space designed for 2, children playing in corners while adults prepared supper, warmth everywhere despite exterior temperatures touching 30 below. "You're going to have more people here within days. You know that, right? Quiet River warned me. The Bennett cabin won't survive what's coming. Neither will most others. When they start failing, everyone will come here because it's the only structure in the township that can handle extreme cold." Margaret's voice carried certainty born from months of systematic data collection, from understanding thermal dynamics that most homesteaders couldn't articulate but were learning through brutal experience. "How many do you think?" "Everyone who wants to live." The echo of Quiet River's words in Margaret's assessment made the prediction feel like foregone conclusion rather than speculation. Jim looked at Anna helping the Mueller children with their evening lessons, saw his daughter's future tied to choices he'd make when desperate neighbors started arriving. "I won't turn anyone away. Even the ones who mocked you? Even Garrett, who's been trying to undermine you since October? Especially them. Because letting people die to prove a point makes me as bad as the cold." Margaret nodded, unsurprised, and Jim realized she'd been testing him, measuring whether success had corrupted the principles that had guided his building. "I'll spread word quietly. Let people know your door is open if their shelters fail. Bennett won't come. Too proud. Clara will bring the children if it comes to that. I've talked to her." The knowledge that Clara Bennett was preparing contingency plans despite her husband's pride told Jim everything he needed to know about how desperate conventional cabin occupants had become. January 12th arrived with a weather shift that felt apocalyptic in its sudden violence. Temperature had been holding around -10 through the early hours, cold but manageable, within the range of normal Dakota winter. Then at noon, the leading edge of the Arctic outbreak hit with the force of physical assault. The temperature dropped from -10 to -5 below zero between noon and 1 in the afternoon. By 3, it touched -15. By sunset, -25. Wind picked up from the northwest, 15 miles per hour, building toward 25, creating wind chill that pushed effective temperature toward -50. Jim stood outside his dugout at dusk, watching the sky turn copper gray in the northwest, feeling wind that burned exposed skin within seconds. This was the warning Quiet River had predicted, the leading edge of something worse coming behind it. He gathered extra wood, checked his drainage one final time, then retreated inside to prepare for what morning would bring. The Bennett cabin struggled from the first hour of temperature collapse. Thomas fed their stove constantly, burning wood at rates that made their remaining supply look pathetic against winter that stretched through February and into March. By 8 in the evening, with exterior temperature touching -30 and still falling, interior temperature hovered at 45 degrees despite continuous firing. Clara wrapped Daniel and his younger brother in every blanket they owned, creating a survival shelter around the stove, while Thomas worked with increasing desperation to maintain heat that physics said he couldn't generate. Wood vanished into flames that couldn't warm walls radiating cold like reverse furnaces. At midnight, with exterior temperature reaching -35, the Bennett cabin interior had dropped to 42 degrees. Frost formed on the walls 3 feet from the stove, Visible evidence that thermal envelope had failed, that the structure couldn't protect its occupants from cold that had moved beyond inconvenience into life-threatening territory. Thomas stood in the center of his cabin, watching his breath crystallize, understanding with sick certainty that he'd built inadequately, that pride and convention had created a death trap, that his family's survival now depended on swallowing everything he'd said and believed since October. Clara saw the realization break across her husband's face, saw pride shatter under the weight of his children's chattering teeth and blue-tinged lips. She waited for him to speak first, knowing that if she suggested what needed to happen, male pride might override paternal instinct. Thomas's voice came out rough, broken. "Pack the children warm. We're going to Halverson's." No apology, no admission, just acknowledgement that survival mattered more than being right. Clara moved immediately, wrapping their sons in layers that might protect them for the quarter-mile journey through cold that could kill in minutes, while Thomas stood defeated in the center of his failed American cabin, understanding that the fool's grave he'd mocked for months was about to save his family's lives. January 15th dawned with silence that felt predatory. Jim stood outside the dugout at first light, watching the northwestern sky turn colors that shouldn't exist in nature, copper bleeding into slate gray like a bruise spreading across the horizon. Temperature read 18 degrees on the thermometer Margaret had loaned him, but the stillness carried menace that numbers couldn't quantify. No birds, no wind, no sound except his own breathing, crystallizing in air that tasted metallic. Anna appeared in the doorway, wrapped in the shawl Katrine had knitted from yarn unraveled from an old sweater. "Papa, why is it so quiet?" "Animals hiding, they know what's coming." Inside, the Mueller family moved through morning routines compressed by crowding, children eating cornmeal mush while Otto and Katrine packed their few possessions tighter to create more living space. 6 people had found rhythm in the 12 by 16 feet, learned to move around each other with practiced efficiency, but the accommodation remained temporary, contingent on weather moderating enough for the Muellers to return to their cabin once Otto made the improvements Jim had outlined. By noon, that contingency had evaporated. Temperature dropped from 18 to 5 degrees in 2 hours, the mercury falling so fast Jim checked his thermometer twice to confirm accuracy. Wind began at 1 in the afternoon, gentle at first, then building with steady malevolence until by 3 o'clock it screamed across the prairie at 25 miles per hour from the northwest, driving temperature toward -10 and still dropping. Jim brought in additional firewood, stacking it against the interior wall where it would stay dry and accessible. Anna helped without being asked, her movements efficient despite hands that had grown soft during weeks of indoor living. The Mueller children watched with eyes that had learned to recognize preparation for crisis, their play subdued by adult tension they couldn't articulate but understood instinctively. By sunset, the thermometer read -25. Wind had increased to 30 miles per hour, sustained, gusts higher, creating wind chill that pushed effective temperature below -50. This was cold that killed quickly, that turned exposed flesh black within minutes, that made breathing without face protection dangerous to lung tissue. Jim maintained the stove at steady burn, not pushing it hard because the dugout's thermal mass would carry them through without excessive fuel consumption. Interior temperature held at 58 degrees while hell descended outside, the contrast between earth shelter and surface conditions growing more extreme with every hour. At the Bennett cabin, 300 yards distant but functionally isolated by cold that would kill anyone attempting the journey unprepared, Thomas fed wood into his potbelly stove with movements that had become mechanical through repetition. He'd been burning continuously since the temperature drop began at noon, consuming wood at rates that made mockery of his winter supply calculations. Clara sat with their sons, both boys wrapped in blankets despite proximity to the stove, their breath visible in air that should have been warm. Daniel's earlier frostbite ached in the cold, fingers he'd damaged in December, now hypersensitive to temperature drops, pain radiating up his forearms when interior conditions fell below 50 degrees. The thermometer Thomas had mounted near the stove read 48 degrees at 8 in the evening. Outside, wind hammered walls that groaned under pressure they'd never been designed to withstand, and temperature continued its relentless descent toward regions that turned survival into active combat against physics. Thomas added more wood, watched flames consume fuel that represented dollars they didn't have, and security that was evaporating with each degree the mercury fell. Clara's eyes tracked his movements with fear she'd stopped trying to hide. Maternal instinct calculating odds that worsened with every passing hour. By 10 o'clock, exterior temperature had reached -32. The Bennett cabin interior measured 44 degrees despite Thomas burning wood faster than safe practice allowed. Frost had begun forming on nail heads that penetrated through the walls, tiny points of condensation marking where cold from outside met minimal warmth from inside, creating surfaces where moisture could freeze despite the stove glowing red 3 feet away. Thomas and Daniel took turns feeding the fire, father and son trading shifts in battle they were slowly losing. Clara tried to sleep with the younger boy, but cold penetrated blankets that should have been adequate, and true rest became impossible when survival required constant vigilance. Midnight brought -35 degrees outside and 42 inside. Water in the basin near the stove developed a skin of ice that thickened despite the bucket sitting within arm's reach of open flame. Thomas stared at the impossible physics, understanding that his cabin had reached its thermal limit, that no amount of wood would raise interior temperature beyond what the structure could physically maintain. Clara spoke from her huddle of blankets, voice carrying the flat affect of someone past fear into grim calculation. "Thomas, how much wood do we have left?" He didn't answer immediately, running numbers he'd already done a dozen times, hoping repetition would change outcomes that remained fixed by mathematics. "Enough for 3 more days at this burn rate. Maybe 4 if we let it get colder inside." "And then?" "I don't know." The admission cost him, pride bleeding away with each degree of heat his cabin couldn't hold. But Clara had moved beyond pride weeks ago, survival instinct overriding social considerations that seemed absurd when measured against blue-tinged children and temperatures falling toward lethality. At 1 in the morning, exterior temperature touched -38. Interior had dropped to 40 degrees despite continuous firing, the cabin's thermal envelope overwhelmed by cold that moved through walls like they were mesh instead of wood. Frost crept across interior surfaces, visible evidence that the structure had failed its fundamental purpose. Thomas fed the stove again, movements automatic, exhaustion making his hands clumsy with split wood that seemed to vanish into heat that went nowhere useful. He checked his older son, found Daniel shivering despite layers of clothing, the boy's damaged fingers white with compromised circulation. At 2 o'clock, Thomas dozed off sitting upright near the stove, exhaustion overriding cold and fear both. His last conscious thought was that he'd wake for the 3 a.m. feeding, maintain the schedule that had kept them alive through December and early January, continue the pattern until weather broke or something changed. He woke at 3:15 to Clara shaking his shoulder with hands that trembled from more than cold, her voice carrying panic that cut through his fatigue like ice water. "Thomas, the fire's out." His mind rejected the information even as his eyes confirmed it. The stove sat cold, fire burned down to ash, and a few pieces of charcoal that held no heat, the metal already radiating cold instead of warmth. He'd slept past his feeding time, exhaustion betraying him at the worst possible moment, and the fire had consumed available fuel and died. Interior temperature had already dropped to 38 degrees, cold enough that his breath showed thick in lamplight, cold enough that frost covered every surface, cold enough that his children's lips were starting to show blue tinge that meant hypothermia approaching. Thomas grabbed kindling, with hands that shook from fear as much as cold, tried to restart the fire using techniques that had worked hundreds of times before. But the stove components had contracted in the extreme cold, creating gaps in the firebox that prevented proper draft. The chimney, exposed to exterior temperatures now touching -40, conducted cold down into the cabin like a reverse furnace, metal surfaces too cold to touch without burning skin. He tried again, fingers growing clumsy, breath coming faster as panic started overriding training. The kindling wouldn't catch, smoke from his attempts filling the cabin without producing flame, and all the while temperature continued dropping, 38 degrees becoming 35, becoming 32. At 4 o'clock, with interior temperature at 30 degrees and still falling, Thomas achieved ignition. Flames caught in kindling, spread to larger splits, began generating heat that should have warmed the space. But the cabin's thermal mass had gone cold. Walls and roof and floor are all radiating chill that absorbed warmth faster than the stove could produce it, and temperature climbed with agonizing slowness while his family huddled in blankets that couldn't protect against cold that had penetrated everything. 4:15, 32 degrees. 4:30, 34 degrees. 4:45, 36 degrees. The stove consumed wood at maximum rate, glowing with heat that seemed to stop 3 feet from the metal, unable to push warmth through air that had become hostile to thermal transfer. Daniel's hands had gone white, circulation compromised by cold and previous damage both. Clara wrapped the younger boy in every available blanket, but his shivering had intensified to convulsions that spoke of core temperature dropping below safe thresholds. Her voice cracked when she finally said what Thomas had been refusing to acknowledge. "We have to go, now, before it's too late." Thomas looked at his cabin, this structure he'd built with his own hands following patterns everyone said were right and proper and American. Understanding that it had failed, that convention and pride had created a death trap, that his family would die within hours if they stayed. "Get them dressed, everything warm we have." Clara moved immediately, wrapping their sons in layers that might protect them for the journey ahead, while Thomas stood in the center of his failure, calculating whether quarter-mile walk through cold that killed in minutes was less dangerous than staying in shelter that was killing them more slowly. At 5 o'clock, with interior temperature having climbed back only to 38 degrees after an hour of maximum firing, Thomas made the decision that broke everything he'd believed since October. They would walk to Halverson's dugout, would beg entry from the man he'd mocked and dismissed, would admit through action, if not words, that the fool had been right and the proper settlers had been catastrophically wrong. The preparation took 15 minutes that felt like hours, bundling children in clothes they owned, plus blankets wrapped and tied, covering faces to protect against wind that would strip flesh from bone given opportunity, creating as much insulation as fabric and desperation could provide. Thomas opened the cabin door at 5:20, and wind hit with force that staggered him, cold so intense it stopped breath in his lungs. The quarter-mile to Halverson's dugout might as well have been miles for all the danger it represented, but staying meant watching his children die, and that was a choice he couldn't make. They stepped into darkness lit only by stars that seemed to mock from a sky so clear it revealed the depth of cold that clarity required. Temperature had reached at -40 now, wind pushing effective exposure toward -70, numbers that meant death measured in minutes for anyone without perfect preparation and iron will both. Clara carried the younger boy, his small body wrapped until only eyes showed, breath freezing on the blanket covering his face. Daniel walked beside his father, the teenager trying to be brave, but stumbling within 50 yards, cold overwhelming his damaged hands and feet, both. Thomas grabbed his son's arm, half carrying him, feeling his own fingers going numb inside gloves that were adequate for normal winter but worthless in this Arctic nightmare. His lungs burned with each breath, even through the scarf wrapped across his mouth and nose, air so cold it damaged tissue with every inhalation. 100 yards. Clara stumbled, nearly fell, caught herself with effort that cost her reserve she didn't have. The younger boy had gone quiet, and Thomas couldn't tell if that meant unconsciousness or just compliance. Couldn't check without stopping. And stopping meant dying. 150 yards. Daniel fell, went down hard, and Thomas had to physically lift him, the boy's legs no longer coordinating properly, hypothermia affecting motor control. They had maybe 5 minutes left before cold won, before exposure pushed them past the point where even reaching shelter would matter. 200 yards. Thomas could see the dugout now, faint outline of grass-covered mound against snow that reflected starlight, chimney pipe rising with smoke that meant warmth and life and everything they needed. But the distance might as well have been infinity for how impossible it seemed to cross. Every step agony, cold penetrating through layers that had seemed adequate and now revealed themselves as pathetic. 225 yards. Clara went down, collapsed with the younger boy still wrapped against her chest. And Thomas felt his heart stop because they were so close, 50 yards from salvation, and his wife was falling in snow that would kill her within minutes. He got her upright through effort that used his last reserves, supporting her and the child both, dragging Daniel, who could barely walk, covering the final 50 yards through willpower that had nothing left to draw on except the knowledge that his family would die if he stopped. The dugout door appeared in front of him like miracle, wood and warmth beyond it, life beyond it. But first he had to announce their presence, had to admit need and beg help from the man whose wisdom he'd dismissed. Thomas pounded on the door with fists too cold to feel impact, breath coming in gasps that burned his lungs, voice cracking when he tried to call out, "Halverson, please!" Silence answered, and for one terrible moment, Thomas thought no one was home, that they'd walked quarter-mile through killing cold to find salvation locked away. He pounded again, harder, desperation overriding the pain in his frozen hands. "Jim, my family is dying." The door opened, and warm air rushed out to meet cold with collision that created visible vapor, 58 degrees meeting -40 in atmospheric violence that paralleled the human drama unfolding. Jim stood in the doorway, fully dressed despite the hour, and Thomas understood that the man had been awake, had been prepared, had been waiting for what Quiet River's warning had promised. Jim took in the scene with professional assessment that wasted no time on judgment or questions, just immediate action in the face of emergency that demanded competence over conversation. Inside. Now. He pulled Thomas across the threshold, helped Clara, who could barely stand, lifted Daniel when the boy couldn't manage the step on his own. Behind Jim, the dugout interior showed crowded with the Mueller family already there. 6 people who'd found shelter weeks ago now, making room for 4 more. Otto and Katrine moving without being asked to create space for the new arrivals. Anna appeared with blankets, 8 years old, but moving with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that crisis demanded contribution, not questions. She helped unwrap the younger Bennett boy, while Jim worked on the older children, checking for frostbite that would show in the coming minutes as frozen tissue warmed and damage became apparent. The Bennett boy's lips were blue, breathing shallow, skin cold when Jim checked his pulse. Classic hypothermia, core temperature dropped below safe threshold, but not yet into the range where recovery became impossible. Jim positioned him near the stove but not too close, knowing that rapid rewarming could trigger shock, that gradual temperature increase was safest for bodies pushed to their limits. Thomas tried to speak, words coming out broken by shivering that had intensified now that adrenaline was fading and his body recognized how close to death they'd come. "I was wrong, I'm sorry. Our cabin. The fire died and I couldn't. We were freezing and—" Jim cut him off with raised hand, voice carrying no judgment, but brooking no argument either. "You're here now, that's what matters." The phrase had become his mantra for people who'd made mistakes and survived long enough to regret them. Simple words that acknowledged reality without requiring shame or explanation. Thomas's shoulders shook, not just from cold, but from breaking of something that had held him rigid through months of struggling to maintain cabin and pride both. Clara collapsed into tears she'd been holding through the walk, relief and terror combining now that immediate crisis had passed, her younger son warming in her arms while she rocked and murmured reassurance to herself as much as him. The dugout held 10 people now, crowded beyond any reasonable capacity, yet the thermal mass absorbed their presence with patient efficiency, redistributing body heat through earth that maintained steady temperature regardless of how many humans sought its protection. The small fire Jim maintained added supplemental warmth, but the real heating came from soil that remembered summer and released it slowly through winter, from physics that didn't care about conventional wisdom or American pride or any human concern beyond mathematics. Daniel Bennett's hands showed frostbite damage when feeling returned, fingers white and painful where tissue had frozen during the walk. Jim treated it with protocols his grandfather had taught, gradual warming in tepid water, careful monitoring for tissue death that would show in the coming hours. The boy bore it with teenage stoicism that cracked occasionally into whimpers he couldn't quite suppress. Otto Muller helped where he could, this man who'd arrived weeks earlier in similar crisis, paying forward the grace he'd received. Katrine made tea with sugar, warm liquid to raise core temperature internally, while external warming proceeded cautiously. The Muller children watched the Bennett children with solemn eyes that recognized reflection of their own near-death experience. Anna moved between families with the ease of someone who'd learned to navigate crowded spaces, bringing blankets where needed, refilling teacups, sitting with the younger Bennett boy to keep him calm while his parents recovered from their own hypothermia. Outside, wind continued its assault on structures built to withstand normal weather, but helpless against this Arctic nightmare. Temperature touched -42 by 6 in the morning, held there through dawn that came late and gray, climbing reluctantly toward -40 by mid-morning, but showing no sign of moderating toward safe ranges. At 7 o'clock, new pounding on the door announced another arrival. Jim opened to find Samuel Garrett, the freighted agent who'd mocked him since October, now standing frost-covered and hypothermic, alone because his success had bought him isolation when crisis came. The man's expensive coat was inadequate against cold that didn't respect money or position, his face showing white patches where frostbite had begun its work, eyes carrying defeat that went beyond physical suffering into recognition that everything he'd built his identity around had proven false. Jim pulled him inside without hesitation, without comment on irony or justice, or any of the things he might have said to the man who'd called his home a grave and promised he'd beg for lumber come winter. Garrett collapsed just inside the door, too cold to speak, pride shattered by cold that measured everyone against the same merciless standard. Anna brought blankets without being asked, helped Jim position Garrett near warmth, made tea that the frayed agent accepted with hands that shook too badly to hold the cup steady. The dugout now held 11 people in space designed for one or two, yet somehow it worked. Thermal mass and careful design creating conditions that sustain life when surface construction failed. Otto Muller and Thomas Bennett exchanged glances, former adversaries now bound by shared experience of humiliation and rescue both. Understanding written across their faces that pride had nearly killed them and their families. That the man they dismissed as fool had proven wiser than everyone who'd mocked him. By afternoon, Quiet River appeared at the door without knocking, entering as if she had permanent invitation, bringing dried meat and roots to share with the assembled refugees. She looked around the crowded space with expression that might have been satisfaction. Her prediction of many visitors confirmed by bodies packed into earth shelter that held steady while the world outside tried to kill everything that breathed. The old ways keep people alive. The new ways keep them proud. Her voice carried across the space, and every adult present understood the judgment implicit in her words. The recognition that indigenous knowledge had been dismissed as primitive by settlers who now owed their lives to principles that predated European arrival by centuries. She looked at Thomas and Samuel particularly, these representatives of conventional wisdom and American superiority, now alive only because a man with Norwegian grandfather and Lakota validation had built differently. You cannot eat pride when cold comes. Better to be warm and humble than frozen and dignified. Thomas couldn't meet her eyes, shame and gratitude mixing into expression that had no name. Samuel Garrett stared at the floor, his entire business model revealed at his predatory sale of inadequate solutions to desperate people who trusted his expertise. Quiet River turned to Jim, and her expression softened into something like approval. Your grandfather would be proud. You kept the knowledge alive. This is good. Before leaving, she addressed the children, all 7 of them watching her with wide eyes. Remember this winter. When you have children, tell them, the earth remembers what people forget. Build with it, not against it. This is how your families survived. She departed into cold that would have killed any of the white settlers within minutes, walking toward her own earth lodge that had weathered this storm and every storm before it with indifference born of proper construction. The temperature held through January 16th and 17th, -40 and below, conditions that would have been impossible to survive in conventional construction. The dugout maintained its steady warmth, the 11 occupants finding rhythm and crowding that enforced cooperation, meals prepared communally, space negotiated through necessity, children learning that survival sometimes meant giving up privacy and independence for collective safety. Thomas spent those days helping where he could, splitting wood and hauling water, contributing labor as partial payment for salvation he could never truly repay. Samuel Garrett recovered slowly, his face carrying contemplation that suggested fundamental recalculation happening behind eyes that had seen too much certainty proven false. On the 3rd day, he spoke to Jim privately, voice rough with admission that cost him everything he'd built his identity around. I sold them the lumber that almost killed them, told them it was proper and American and sufficient. I was wrong about everything. Jim remembered Sarah dying in a cabin that proper American construction couldn't keep warm, remembered his own journey from ignorance to knowledge purchased through grief. You didn't know. Now you do. So stop selling death traps. Help them build properly instead. The simple redirection seemed to unlock something in Garrett, giving him path forward that wasn't just drowning in guilt. January 22nd brought the thaw, temperature climbing toward 10 degrees that felt tropical after the extreme cold. The 11 occupants of Jim's dugout emerged to assess what winter had taken and what it had taught. The damage assessment told the story in numbers Margaret Hayes would later record in her ledger. The Bennett cabin, structural distress throughout, 70% of winter fuel consumed in 10 days, repairs needed before habitable again. Other township cabins showed similar devastation. Jim's dugout, zero damage, fuel consumption for 11 people less than conventional cabin would have required for 4. Through late January into March, the transformation accelerated. Thomas Bennett didn't build a speech about his error. He simply started excavating for a new structure following Jim's designs, his sons working beside him. Otto Muller expanded the temporary shelter that had saved his family into permanent earth-protected home. 3 other families began similar work, breaking frozen ground with determination, born from knowing exactly what failure looked like. Samuel Garrett's freight wagons arrived one morning in early February, carrying drainage tile and ventilation pipe instead of dimension lumber. He found Jim outside the dugout, clearing snow from the south slope where Anna would plant her spring garden. I'm stocking supplies for earth shelter construction now, and I'll share your plans with anyone who asks, no charge. Jim looked at this man who'd mocked him for months, now offering redemption through action instead of words. People will need help understanding the drainage systems, the ventilation calculations. Then I'll learn them. Teach me. And so the knowledge spread, not through pride swallowed, but through necessity acknowledged. Jim became teacher to men who'd been his critics, sketching systems in dirt, explaining thermal mass with patience that came from remembering his own journey from ignorance. On a gray afternoon in late February, Jim and Anna walked to a spot north of their dugout where prairie grass grew thick despite winter. Jim carried stones he'd selected from the creek bed, smooth river rock that would weather well. Together, they built a simple cairn, and when the base was complete, Jim pulled out his best chisel. Anna watched the letters emerge. Sarah Halverson, 1848 to 1884. Her loss built this shelter. For Mama. So she's part of what we built here. Anna traced the carved words with fingers that had learned to work wood and stone beside her father. She would be proud of you, Papa, that you helped everyone, even the ones who were mean. Jim pulled his daughter close, this child who carried Sarah's kindness without her mother's guidance. She'd be proud of you too. The way you helped, the way you shared. Clara Bennett visited the memorial when spring finally arrived, bringing bread she'd baked. She stood reading the inscription, understanding flowing across her face. You gave her meaning, made her death matter by saving us. The thought had occurred to Jim during dark nights when grief felt heaviest. But building the dugout, teaching others, saving families through knowledge purchased at terrible cost, all of it transformed loss into something that served life instead of just marking death. By April, 6 families had completed earth-sheltered homes following Jim's designs. The transformation wasn't just physical structures, but social fabric itself. Pride replaced by pragmatism, convention superseded by performance, judgment dissolved by shared survival. One evening in late April, Thomas Bennett visited with a gift wrapped in cloth. He unwrapped it to reveal a book his family had assembled during winter's crowding. Drawings, words, gratitude expressed in languages and handwriting that marked the diversity of people who'd found common ground in Earth Shelter. Anna studied each page with attention that recognized the gift's significance. The final page held Margaret Hayes's precise script. That winter of 1887 taught us what our ancestors knew. The earth beneath our feet is warmer than the pride in our hearts. Jim Halverson showed us that wisdom looks like foolishness until the storm proves who was wise all along. That evening, as spring wind moved across Dakota Prairie carrying warmth that winter's memory made sweeter, Jim opened his grandfather's journal to the final page. Anna leaned against his shoulder. What does grandfather's last writing say, Papa? Jim translated, his voice carrying weight of everything the words had meant through October's mockery, December's cold, and January's crisis. If I die before you build, remember, the earth keeps its promises. Men forget when they're afraid, when they're proud, when they want to look like their neighbors. But underground, the mathematics never lie. Build true, stay humble, and you'll save the ones who matter. Anna considered this wisdom that had traveled across ocean and through generations to keep her alive. We saved more than just us, didn't we? We did, and you'll teach your children the same way I taught you. That's how knowledge stays alive. Jim stood in the doorway of his dugout, looking out at landscape transformed. Across the township, families lived in earth shelters that would protect them through next winter and all winters after. Structures that acknowledge environment instead of fighting it, that worked with geology instead of against it. And somewhere, he hoped, Sarah knew that her death hadn't been meaningless, that the cold that took her had taught him how to prevent cold from taking others, that love could survive grief and transform into protection that extended beyond family to embrace everyone who needed shelter from the storm.